Hello everyone, welcome back to my channel. This is Paramita and I heartily welcome you to my channel Paramita PM. If you are new to my channel, then I would request you to go through the content of my channel, look at the videos, and if you really find those videos helpful and if they really heighten your interest, then do like it, share it, and do not forget to subscribe to my channel. And most importantly, please turn on the notification bell button so that you get notified whenever I upload any new videos on my channel. So now, without any further ado, let's get into the lecture. Next, let us have a look at the features of post-colonial literature, because if we do not look at the features of post-colonial literature, then we won't be able to understand, what kinds of themes or what are the major themes that are dealt with by the post-colonial writers in their literary works. The first significant feature of post-colonial literature is colonialism. Because colonialism had such a profound impact on these colonized nations, that the post-colonial writers, through their literary works, they challenge the colonizers or the Europeans. Through their writing, they challenge their ideas, the established notions related to cultural imperialism, cultural superiority of the West. So colonialism has to be, a very dominant theme in post-colonial literature. So in their literary works, we find that these post-colonial writers, they address the issue of colonialism. They try to analyze the text, in terms of colonialism, that how, everything is a construct, that how, the identity of the East or the Eastern countries is a cultural construct. So, and they also look at the relationship between the colonizer and the colonized. Therefore, we find that through their literary works, the post-colonial writers, they try to address this issue. They try to address this central issue, that how literature or how literary discourse, is also responsible for perpetuating the same idea that the West always, established, that they represent the superior culture, while the East or the countries belonging to the eastern part of the world, they represent an inferior culture. Therefore, they are the ones who need to be civilized, they are the ones who need to be enlightened. And the West or the Europeans being convinced of their own superiority, already being convinced of their of being, an enlightened race, they say that it is their responsibility, to spread this light of knowledge or to civilize these uncivilized nations. The next important feature of post-colonial literature is appropriation of colonial languages. When I say appropriation of colonial languages, I mean that it has always been a practice among the post-colonial writers, to include their native dialect, or let's say to include their native language, native terms and phrases when they write anything. It is true that they have no other option but to write in the English language or in the French, but still, they want to include terms and phrases related to their own native language. And this is what I call appropriation of colonial language, which means that of course they do use the English language, the language of the colonizer, the language that was used to oppress them, to subjugate them, but then the idea is, or the purpose behind using, or although they write in the English language, although they make use of the language of the colonizer, yet they incorporate native terms and phrases, and they do it purposely because the purpose is to use the language of the colonizer, in order to challenge the colonial authority of the language. In fact, they use, this language where, of course, it is English. In which they write, but it represents a different kind of English, which is imbibed or which is filled with, native terms and phrases. So the post-colonial writers, in order to, bring to the fore their own culture, or in order to, let's say, glorify their own culture, they simply use the colonial language English, but then they mix it with their native terms and phrases, and they do it on purpose because they want to use this language in order to challenge, the colonial authority of the English language, and at the same time using the language of the colonizer to challenge them. So this sounds very, very interesting when it comes to, reading a post-colonial text. The next important feature is meta-narrative. Now, I would try to explain this in very simple terms, this meta-narrative. As far as the colonizers are concerned, they always have a story, to narrate. And what kind of story do they narrate? The story that very conveniently, they narrate is that they are the superior ones, be it in terms of culture, be it in terms of historical progress, be it in terms of politics. So, they always narrate this story with regard to their own culture, whereby they represent, the Eastern countries as an, whereby they, let's say, they represent, the non-European nations, especially the Eastern countries, to have an inferior culture. So they always tell this story where we find that they represent themselves as the savior, where they represent themselves as the rescuer of these colonized nations, and they always tend to, represent the colonized people as inferior, wild, savage, uncivilized, and unenlightened. Therefore, very conveniently they construct this story that, in fact, the colonized nations are fortunate enough that the Europeans have taken this responsibility on their shoulder to civilize them, to enlighten them. In fact, it has nothing to do with their own profit, but rather it's a noble mission. And they, like I said, they simply narrate this story because somewhere the Europeans, the colonizers, they have to, justify their presence in the colony. So what do? They simply construct this idea, or they simply construct this idea about the Orient or the Eastern countries, thereby representing themselves as their savior, as their rescuer, as if they have taken this responsibility, and they have done a favor to the colonized nations by taking the initiative to bring them out of darkness and spread the light of knowledge, thereby enlightening them. So very conveniently we find how the Europeans, they construct this story, this narrative about themselves. But this is something which appears to be this narrative appears to be very, very problematic to the post-colonial writers, because they feel that this is only one version of the story which the Europeans have conveniently, constructed for their own benefit. In fact, they believe that as far as colonialism is concerned as an enterprise, although the Europeans project colonialism as a very noble enterprise. But if we look at colonialism, or if we look at this issue from the perspective of the African writers, from the post-colonial writers, we shall see that according to them, post-colonialism is in fact a very violent, bloody, terrible enterprise, and it never had anything to do, with enlightenment or with civilization. It never aimed to civilize the colonized people, or it never had any noble mission. The main interest behind colonialism was only, and the only reason being, economic interest. Colonialism, this as an enterprise, was simply driven by economic interest. So this is another aspect, where we find the post-colonial writers, they try to point out the other side of the story, where they say that they try to figure out, or they try to point out that how all these stories are constructed. This is not the truth. This is not the fact. This is a story that is conveniently constructed by the Europeans, and therefore narrated from a certain point of view, which means it is narrated from the European perspective, or the European point of view. And this is what they want to challenge through their writing, and this is what the post-colonial writers do in their literary text. They simply challenge this construct. They simply challenge this. They simply challenge, colonialism, and they also try to, point out how the writers are still, they are struggling with this legacy of colonialism, because something is still left behind. Although the period of colonialism has come to an end, yet the after effects of colonialism, or the impacts, the effects of colonialism are still prevalent, and this is something with which the writers are still struggling. So when I talk about the theme of colonialism that is dealt with by post-colonial writers in their writings, what we find that there is, colonialism led to displacement of one's language, it led to displacement of one's culture, religion. For instance, Christian missionaries. Because the Europeans felt that they have the light of God, and therefore it was their duty to spread their religion. Therefore, Christian missionaries were sent to these colonies, whereby they were converted to Christianity. And like I said, that the effects were so deep, the effects were so profound, that even in the post-independence era, even in the post-independence period, when these colonies are already, when these colonies are no longer in the state of colonization, that nations were built, emulating Western style European nations, and having the same administrative setup. Therefore, we can say that although colonialism ended, but we cannot say that the effects of colonialism also ended on that very day. Rather, we can see that how it extended beyond the actual period of it continued. Okay, it did not end with the actual period of decolonization. Rather, it continued, it extended, and it is because of this reason that we find writers, like I said, are still dealing with the legacy of colonialism. The next important feature of post-colonial literature is colonial discourse. So first let us have a look at the meaning of the term discourse. Discourse can be defined as a collection of statements or opinions about a specific topic or about a specific subject. as the term means written or spoken communication, discourse can be about anything. Now, if we try to figure out the meaning of colonial discourse, then colonial discourse means in a similar manner, a collection of statements, opinions about the colonized people. A discourse, or you can say it is a narrative about the colonized people, about the colonized nations, that is narrated from the European perspective or from the perspective of the colonizers. So, how does this colonial discourse, function? As far as this colonial discourse is concerned, we find the colonial discourse, what it does is, it simply stereotypes, it simply generalizes, or let's say labels, the colonized people as wild, savage, uncivilized and unenlightened, while the Europeans, they simply represent themselves as just the opposite, that they are, knowledgeable people, they are superior, they represent the enlightened race, and they are, like I said, they are civilized. And just because they are civilized, so that gives them the right, to do something that would, or, to justify colonialism. Why? Because according to the Europeans, colonialism is meant for civilizing the uncivilized. It is meant for enlightening the unenlightened. So this kind of colonial discourse was used by the Europeans to justify, colonialism as a very noble enterprise, and at the same time justify their presence in the colony. So therefore it becomes, this colonial discourse, it becomes a very important theme for post-colonial writers, and therefore they simply challenge, the objective of the post-colonial writing therefore is, to attack this colonial discourse and bring to the forefront, bring to the surface the underlying intention, or the actual intention underlying such discourse, that how this colonial discourse, is used by the Europeans to establish their racial superiority, to establish their supremacy, and therefore give themselves, which would, very conveniently give them the right to dominate the eastern countries or the people in the colonies. So this is a role that is fulfilled, or that is fulfilled by the, or that is served by the colonial discourse, and therefore this colonial discourse is, let's say, becomes very, very instrumental in establishing the superiority of the West and the inferiority of the East or the Orient. Another significant feature of post-colonial writing is nationalism. Patriotism, or this patriotic feeling of the post-col writers, made them, glorify, valorize or value their social, political and cultural, identity of their nation. In fact, the post-col writers, they had to face several obstacles in the form of native corruption. There was this general lack of democracy, and there were corrupted politicians as well that betrayed, that did not allow the dreams of these decolonized nations materialize. Therefore, the post-colonial writers had to undergo much obstacle. The other significant feature of post-colonial literature is valorization of cultural identity. The post-colonial writers, they simply through their literary works, they challenged the European ideology, their set of beliefs with regard to their native culture and religion, because we already know now that the Europeans, they always look down upon the culture, the religion of the colonized nations. So what the post-colonial writers aimed to do through their writing was they simply wanted to challenge this ideology, their set of attitudes or their set of beliefs concerning their culture, concerning their religion, and they did that by glorifying, by valorizing their own native culture. In fact, this kind of valorization or this kind of glorification of their culture, their religion, is reflected in the narrative style of their writing, in the narrative style of their literary works. In fact, we come across, a good chunk of African literature that resembles spoken language, because there was a time when much of African literature, was oral literature. So what they do now, so these African writers, so what they do, they simply made use of these oral narratives in order to glorify or valorize their native culture and heritage. Decolonization struggles is another major characteristic of post-colonial literature. By the term decolonization, we mean the undoing of colonialism, the end of colonialism, when a colonized country, no longer remains under the rule of the colonizer. So that makes a nation state decolonized. As far as this feature of post-colonial literature is concerned, decolonization, struggle, the post-col writers say that this is, not just political, this colonialism, but it is mental and cultural at the same time. People, when they got, when these nations got colonized, they not just physically or politically got colonized, but mentally also they got colonized. So what the post-colonial writers aim to do is they not only wanted, to decolonize or to dismantle the political structures, but they also wanted to decolonize the mind, which means to read the mind of colonial philosophies, therefore leading to a mental and cultural liberation. Because it's not just getting politically free, but it is also essential for these colonized nations to get rid of the colonial ideologies, to get rid of these colonial philosophies, because then only it would help in decolonizing the mind, freeing the mind, therefore leading to mental and cultural liberation. Rewriting history is another significant feature of post-colonial literature. As far as the Europeans are concerned, as far as the colonizers are concerned, they believed that the colonized nations have no history of their own. They are ignorant people, and therefore they have not made any contribution to human progress. They came up with this story, in order to justify colonialism. And in fact, they felt that the colonized nations are therefore fortunate that they are getting the opportunity to get civilized, to become enlightened. And it is this mission that the Europeans have undertaken. It is the mission that they have taken on their shoulder. So, it is this version of history that troubled post-col writers. And it is this version of story where they found that the European nations, these colonizers, they simply projected themselves as the saviors of these colonized nations. So it troubled them, it bothered them. And it is this version of European history that made post-col writers write their, own history from their own perspective, thereby exposing colonialism, this enterprise of colonialism, as something terrible and violent. In fact, post-col writers also claimed, they said, that history is a matter of perspective. There cannot be just, one true history. There are several versions of it. So the story that was being narrated by the colonizers, it was their part of the story, their version of the story, which cannot be justified in any way, because they were simply generalizing, they were simply stereotyping the Eastern countries, a kind of, let's say, labeling the Orient, labeling the Eastern countries as inferior in everything, be it culturally, socially, or politically. Therefore, as if they were the representatives of God, they have the light of God, and therefore it is their, let's say, moral duty, to civilize these nations. But post-col writers, they simply wanted, to expose, to reveal what actually, lied beneath this enterprise of colonialism, that it had nothing to do, it had nothing to do with any civilizing mission, or it had no civilizing, it had no such objective. Okay, in fact, the colonizers, they only wanted to strengthen themselves. They only intended to strengthen their own country economically. Therefore, they embarked on this huge project of colonialism for the sake of their own economic interest. So with this, I come to the end of this lecture. I tried my best to explain what post-colonial literature is, who the authors are, and what is the aim of post-colonial literature, as well as its features. So I hope you like this lecture and find it helpful in understanding post-colonial literature and its features. So I would request you that if you really find that these lectures on colonialism are helping you a lot in comprehending this area of study, this area of literary study, then do like it, share it, and please do not forget to subscribe to my channel. Until then, bye-bye.